This is an ABC podcast.
Thank you and welcome to Saturday Extra on this Saturday, July the 3rd. Today, a big anniversary acknowledged and analysed. 100 years since 13 men gathered to set up the Chinese Communist Party when China was terribly low, and they contributed to changing the world. Now China's regained its purpose and then some. The pictures emanating this week from Beijing were a reminder of how far the nation's travelled and how much the CCP believes it alone is guarantor of continued success. And here in Australia, our own country's federal system of governance seems under challenge, with premiers, doctors and federal officials at each other, hilariously satirised by Sydney comic Jimmy Rees.
Queensland's holding a press conference.
Queenslanders, I've got something important to say.
We lost the Origin and we're massive losers.
Shut up, New South Wales. We've got to wear these, okay? Because bloody hell.
So elegantly put, Queensland.
Thank you.
Now Western Australia's holding a presser.
Westralians, I regret to inform you that we've got one case of corona. Shut my own border. Let me have a go. There's one case of corona. Lock everyone in and turn the flights away. Oh, shut up.
That's part 22 of Jimmy Rees's YouTube video series, Meanwhile in Australia, which might bring some much-needed laughs. And with vision added, I can assure you it is very amusing indeed. But later this half hour, we'll take a look at what sort of nation we are becoming, how our federation is coping with this pandemic challenge. And China after 8, as we look both backward and forwards with Professors Kerry Brown, Rana Mitter and China scholar Linda Javan. It's a really interesting discussion. And of course our guest, the Game Changer quiz question after 8. First to Europe, though, where the European Union is said to be facing one of its bigger crises thus far, with calls from some quarters to expel Hungary from its membership. That's largely over Hungary's new law limiting LGBTQI education and discussion. Now, the law has been roundly condemned as discriminatory, and that law is, of course, just part of an increasingly authoritarian state in Hungary after Prime Minister Viktor Orban. The EU is meant to be, after all, a union of democracies with quite definite aspirational values of openness. This all played out at an important EU summit meeting, the last before the summer break, at the very end of last week. Stephen Erlanger is the chief diplomatic correspondent in Europe for the New York Times, and he's been covering Europe for more than 2 decades. Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, I'm happy to do it. Thank you. You're too kind.
Stephen, tell us more, if you would, about this Hungarian bill on the so-called homosexual material, which was provocatively, perhaps, signed into law just a couple of days before the EU summit.
Well, it's part of Viktor Orban's kind of cultural war against what he regards as loose Western values that are undermining family values and Christian values. And so this is part of the way he is appealing to his own countrymen, which is a very small country, speaking a language no one else speaks really, and who had obviously been under a form of Soviet occupation for a very, very long time. So the bill, he argues, it leaves sex education to parents rather than to schools. But what it does is it bans schools from having discussions of non-traditional sexual attitudes and identities. And for the European Union, this is for most of the other leaders a violation of not just values, but the EU treaties that protect the rights of every individual.
Now, he says, I gather, that it's got nothing to do with the rights of adults, and that, in fact, in quite a strong statement, he says under the communist regime, he was a freedom fighter, he fought for homosexuals' rights. This law's not about them, it's about the rights of the kids and their parents. Now, this is a somewhat cute subsection, I suppose.
Well, this is his argument, that consenting adults can do whatever they want, but this is about keeping parents the rights to educate their children on sexual matters rather than have the state do it or have schools do it. Now, that's his argument. And I remember him in his first prime ministership in the 80s when he was skinny and dark-haired and quite liberal. And he's changed quite a lot. I mean, he's understood a different kind of politics. In fact, he proudly calls Hungary an illiberal democracy. And by illiberal, what he really means is less authoritarian, though one can certainly characterize it that way, than a democracy that is against gender-bending, Brussels, neoliberal, everything's okay, you know, kind of culture and politics that he believes should be rejected by Hungary. But also, you know, Vladimir Putin makes the same points. I mean, that somehow they are representing traditional European Christian values, which are all going to hell in the rest of Europe and certainly in the United States.
Well, this is so he's really introduced an element of identity politics, I suppose, and brought it to the surface. He is facing elections, isn't he? It has to be said. So is he copying that Putin? Because Putin did this, didn't he, back in 2013, really?
And also Poland has done it. I mean, the sort of so-called Law and Justice Party, known as PiS, under Kaczynski, has done very much the same kind of identity cultural politics, very much based on the Catholic Church, but it is a sort of conservative value. And you see it in the Republican Party in America too. I mean, Orban, in a way, has set a kind of model, and conservatives in the West are taking bits and pieces of it. The problem of Hungary is, of course, constitutional and legal. And what the European Union is really is a band of people who agree to behave under basically the same set of treaties and the same sets of laws that govern all of them. And those include individual rights. I mean, there are tax issues, all kinds of issues. It's a very technocratic thing, but it's not just values. It's also law.
Well, and I want to come to that in just a moment. But just given that we are talking about this critical fact of children being involved, the Prime Minister of Luxembourg talked openly about his own homosexuality, I gather, at this meeting, which was a very powerful intervention.
It was very, very moving. Mark Rutte, who's the Dutch prime minister, basically said everyone was in tears. Bettel described, and described to the press too, by the way, how uncomfortable it was to talk to his parents and just
This is the Prime Minister, Xavier Bettel.
Yes, precisely. And he got married 6 years ago to another man, and he is quite open about it. But he said it was very, very difficult, particularly as a young person, where he felt his identity was should be hidden. And he didn't want that for anyone else. He certainly didn't want that for Hungarian kids. And what he argued to Orban was, you know, it's not education or some advertisement that I saw that made me understand that I was gay. It's always been in me, and education isn't really the point. He also said he felt Orban had changed radically, and Mark Rutte, the Dutch Prime Minister, suggested Orban, if he wasn't happy inside the European Union, should think about leaving it, which Orban certainly won't do.
Orban was there to hear all this, was he?
Oh yes. I mean,
Did he show anything?
Complained. Well, I mean, I wasn't in the room, but people who were there described him at one point saying, "Everyone's against me. Why do you all hate me so much?" Because the other thing he's been very important for in the European argument is migration. He's been very much anti-uncontrolled migration. I mean, the whole point of the European Union, to some degree, is this Schengen process, whereby once you're inside, you can travel without showing passports and so on. And his argument is, particularly from 2005, when you had this big wave of migration from Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, lots of places, he said, if we can't defend the borders of Schengen, then we can't defend anything, that at least on those Schengen borders, we have to be strict. And though he was criticized for the way he did it, there were a lot of European leaders who thought quite soon afterwards, the man has a point. So he's very intelligent. No one ever argues that. And he's been very clever at using all the rules of this technocratic grouping, the EU, to the advantage of Hungary and his own political party. And they've gotten tons of money from the European Union that he's used in openly political ways, which is another whole problem that, again, the EU isn't very good at dealing with, though they've begun to talk about conditioning money, aid for the COVID recovery fund, on behavior. But we'll see if that actually happens.
It's going to be a big challenge, isn't it? So just before we leave that, if you say he won't leave Hungary, he would never think of leaving the EU, and will they persist? What will happen?
Well, I think what was going to happen is there will be a court case before the ECJ, which doesn't have to take forever to make a judgment. And I suspect that they will judge against this law, and Hungary will adjust the law to stay within the decision of the court. And we will proceed in bits and pieces the way we've done otherwise. And Hungary isn't going to leave, and it's not going to have its problem solved. And it's going to be an irritant to Brussels until Orban passes from the scene.
Okay, look, so just finally, in terms of the tests underway for the EU and its purpose, its values, Timothy Garton-Ash, the British analyst whom we've had as a guest, he said in a recent debate on Europe Forum that the EU was facing an existential crisis, another one you might say, over Hungary, but also Poland and Slovenia, where you are currently. He said the EU's constitution so clearly prioritises democracy and the rule of law, and yet it's so clearly being challenged. Now, how highly would you rate it? Hungary, all of them, in fact, from the old Eastern Europe. How highly would you rate their challenge to the EU status quo?
Well, I think it's quite considerable. Existential is one of those words I like to avoid.
Yes.
Very few things are existential. By the way, normally human beings just blunder on and somehow manage not to have their existence disappear. But that will be true of this grouping too. But the Europe of 27, even minus Britain, is not the Europe of 15, right? The introduction of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, the former Soviet bloc countries, have changed the makeup of the European Union, the ideas of the European Union, even notions of what is important in ways that Brussels has not yet recognized. Brussels still patronizes these new members. And I think that's part of Brussels' big challenge,
right,
which is how to treat people who have different views on certain issues and yet are full members, how they treat them decently and absorb their points of view in what is a consensual grouping, rather than treat them like subhumans and somehow second-class members. Now, the challenge of rule of law is real, but you have the court and you have money instruments. Part of the problem is Brussels needs to use them, and that's a different issue. But the real challenge, I would say, is they don't always agree.
Like a genuine democracy. That's what you have to deal with. The fact that there's differing views.
These people are voters too.
Look, Stephen, really lovely to have you on the program. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Stephen Erlanger, Chief Diplomatic Correspondent in Europe for the New York Times, based in Brussels. Well, up next, the challenges to our federation as we know it this week from all those public pronouncements. Yes, to be colloquial, it was a hell of a week, wasn't it? Ostensibly about COVID management, but ending up canvassing a lot more. We saw doctors rowing over how to brief patients properly. We saw political egos on full display. We saw an inability to settle on clear medical advice, and maybe the media has questions to answer here too. Plus power plays between federal and state governance systems that I can't really remember in my lifetime. It was not edifying. Late yesterday, the Prime Minister emerged from quarantine with a stated set of plans foreshadowing normal life for Australians, or something approaching it, what New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian had been pleading for at the start of the week. Can Mr Morrison re-establish more predictable order with these pronouncements? What does the tone of discussion around the vaccine rollout tell us about the health of our federal system? That careful mix of state and Commonwealth powers settled on back in 1901. Have state premiers somehow changed the operating rules? Well, joining us to wrestle with this unfolding drama, Prue Gowen, Professor of Social Interventions and Policy at Western Sydney University, a former Liberal New South Wales Government Minister and Sex Discrimination Commissioner, and Greg Craven, Emeritus Professor at the Australian Catholic University, where he was Vice-Chancellor till recently, and he is a constitutional lawyer by training. Welcome to you both.
Thank you, Geraldine.
And I'd like to hear your impressions of the week first, before we drill down a bit. Prue Gowen, yours.
Well, I think Mr Morrison really had no choice but to pronounce a plan. We are now seeing a rapid, much more rapid rollout. I mean, there are all sorts of political imperatives that drove the week, but we must not continue to just keep talking about suppression. He did need to move the debate to how do we live with it, in the sense that what do we do when 50% of the country is vaccinated? What do we do when all the vulnerable groups, that is those in nursing homes, those over the age of 60, 70, 80, are vaccinated? Do we still keep doing lockdowns? But to your point about the Federation, of course, he can't do that on his own. The federal government has a supreme authority when it comes to raising money. The states gave that authority up during World War II, and it never came back with income tax. And, of course, the states rule supreme when it comes to health policy. And we've seen that work very well and very badly, both at the same time. And I think this week, Mr Morrison had to bring those two things together properly in a way that was constructive, and let's hope that that is now what's going to happen. But the response of the states is, I think, very encouraging. They too recognise that they couldn't continue to just bicker, and that both had to play to their strengths. And this plan, I think, gives people, both state and federal governments, the opportunity to do that.
How do you see it, Greg Craven?
Well, it's almost like a macabre comic opera. For better or worse, we've been living for many, many decades in what's routinely been described as one of the most centralised federations on earth. And we seem to have descended to a group of loosely connected warring tribes where the Commonwealth no longer issues orders or mandates, but pleads with state premiers to do the right thing. And depending upon how they feel, they may agree with the Commonwealth or they may dismiss it with absolute contempt. And it's remarkable. I'm not saying that the previous centralised position was an optimal position, but the change is absolutely dramatic, and it is a little unnerving at a time when probably there's a premium on coordination and collaboration.
I mean, you've got a very good turn of phrase, of course, Greg Craven, but you did write in an article back in April, so this was quite prescient. COVID has changed this game of federalism like Kerry Packer changed cricket.
Well, it has, because what we've been used to, and Catherine's quite right, I mean, really, even before World War II, going right back to just after Federation for a whole lot of complicated constitutional reasons, the states have been largely premiers of the Commonwealth, and the Commonwealth has used money as the jail. And over the last 2 years, last 18 months, all of that has collapsed in a way that I don't think anybody could have foreseen. Constitutional academics like me have made our career writing about the decline of the states. And yet, looking out now, you would say that the landscape has fundamentally altered.
Prue, I was going to ask you, can you recall a time in your lifetime when state premiers were quite as prominent as they are today?
Well, I think when I was much younger, the premiers were the stars of the show, and I can still remember premiers' conferences where they would all gang up on the Commonwealth. I certainly remember as a Commonwealth official watching that with them, all sorts of initiatives that the Commonwealth tried. I think we need to remember that this is a particular time. We have never had a health crisis like this, where the responsibilities and the constitutional authority rests very largely with the states. I think once this is over, and to Greg's point, it's never going to completely go back to the way it was, because we now recognise that these dramas, these pandemics might happen again. I think once this is over, I think there will be more of a reversion to the normal situation where the Commonwealth is the big fat blank checkbook, and the states gang up on the Commonwealth to get as much out of them as they can. But in the end, the Commonwealth decides. I mean, the big change to me, and look, you can go back to 1901, but in my lifetime, the big change really was Gough Whitlam, when he really invented a much richer and broader role for the Commonwealth. Suddenly the Commonwealth started doing all sorts of things that the states had been doing, and that has continued. I mean, domestic violence, disability, aged care. They have a huge health department, don't run a hospital. They have a huge education department, don't run a school.
This is the Commonwealth.
The Commonwealth. So all of these things have evolved really since the 1970s. And I can't see, after this crisis is over, that it will stay very changed, but it will stay somewhat changed, because it's been a very big lesson for the Commonwealth that you have to recognise the constitutional authority of the states much more than they probably they've got used to not doing that.
I wonder,
got used to imposing it.
Because I think that's the question, Greg Craven, and I think that's what you are sort of saying. Can the genie be put back into the bottle? What is your suspicion?
Well, look, I suspect that Prue's right. I mean, there will be some sort of correction, but on the other hand, this has really disrupted one of the most fundamental psychological processes in Australian history, which is that the states have been in more or less continual decline since 1901. And when that happens, you start to get a psychology of failure. And part of the reason that the states have been weak is because they feel desperately weak and they behave as if they're weak. The danger is that the states really have seen now that they do have a lot of power, and if they're determined enough, they can exercise it. I think one of the most fascinating things is, and Prue's quite right, the Commonwealth has always used the chequebook to crush the states, but we're seeing the limitations of that. I mean, Victoria, for example, continual lockdowns, vast majority of JobKeeper going out there. But could the Commonwealth actually have throttled Dan Andrews by taking JobKeeper off Victoria? No, unless he wants to lose every single seat in Victoria. So my suspicion is that, yes, it will probably tip back to some extent, but I think there's been a Rubicon crossed at this point.
Well, I suppose that's the fascinating thing. Like, you think of Western Australia, with the very strong sense of self that has re-emerged there, and yet that you can sense the Prime Minister knows he's hemmed in, because the next election has to be by May. I hate bringing that into it, but, people like Paul Bongiorno, the political correspondent, remarking that, in fact, he arguing just in a very interesting column this week, that those critical seats in central Queensland, which have got lots of people very vaccine hesitant, and people like Pauline Hanson saying, very visibly she won't have anything put into her system, that he has got to keep they never leave him. They never leave his consciousness. And maybe they play a role in the way he's even speaking, Greg Craven.
Well, I think there's no doubt of that. And I think one of the things that this whole situation has done is it's exposed one of the great myths of the Australian national character, which is that we're all the same. There's no difference between a West Australian. There's no difference between a Queenslander. I think one of the things you're seeing is a very, very determined assertion of a West Australian identity, which you and I from background know very, very well. A state that never wanted to come into federation and made at least one determined attempt to get out. I think it's perfectly obvious that Premier Palaszczuk is playing to very determined state feeling in her state. And the problem for the Prime Minister is, right, we can move in with the financial tanks and crush them, but we can crush our own electoral prospects at the next election at the same time.
Well, in fact, it's interesting, Prue, that, as you say, buckets of federal money went out to all manner of people in the different states, particularly Victoria, and it was obviously simply taken for granted. I mean, that's another very big learning about modern democracies, isn't it? That there's an expectation that governments will provide and they won't necessarily have to be thanked for it. It's just that's their job. So he doesn't. The feds don't even get the sort of praise for that, do they?
Yeah, it's very interesting that incumbency has been wonderful for state premiers. And as you say, when it comes to that big blank checkbook, we are so used to the feds stepping in now and saving states at various times. And in a sense, we default to why isn't the Prime Minister making a decision here, despite our state commitments and our, not parochialism, but our deep loyalties to our states. So it has been interesting to watch the premiers really benefit from this, but it's clearly not having the same impact on Mr. Morrison's standing, but obviously some impact. But
in fact, several listeners. I'm talking to you, and there's a sort of a lot of texts coming in saying that they are reminding me that states are filling that they see as a leadership void, and that there isn't perceived leadership that they think they associate with national interest leadership coming from the feds, and so the states are perceived to be stepping up in that respect.
Well, I think because this is a health crisis, quite necessarily, the states must do that. I mean, the federal government has always been hopeless at service delivery. The two services it's used to delivering, which is tax and welfare. It's finally, after 100 years, refined that, but ask it to step into anything different, a new service delivery area, as we have seen with the vaccine rollout, it just can't do it. Now, I don't think I'm not saying anything that's partisan. Neither major party in federal government could do this. It's just not something you can do in such a hugely diverse geographically separate country. So
that's where you need the collaboration, perceived collaboration.
Well, you absolutely need that. I'm trying to think, though. Look, I can think of times when I've been in ministerial council meetings where we have all ganged up on the Commonwealth, but it's never really come off because they have the checkbook and they just shrug their shoulders and listen to the debate and then say, well, this is what you're getting, as if that debate hadn't occurred.
Look, I've just about 2.5 minutes left. Has it struck you both, as good followers of the culture, that we Australians tend to panic a little bit? It seems to me to be the reverse of that keep calm and carry on, that joke that's hurled at the Brits. We're okay when everything has been all right, but we fall apart a bit when things start to go pear-shaped. It's sort of, I've sensed a somewhat brittleness, except in bushfires when we behave simply magnificently, where we've had a lot of practice.
We're very hard on ourselves, I think. We are actually quite a well-run country. Federation, there are lots of federations around the world. They have their advantages and disadvantages. Ditto centralised governments. We're very hard on ourselves. We were very pleased with ourselves last year for success in suppressing the virus, but as soon as we start to slip behind in anything, we beat ourselves up. And I think that is an immaturity. But on the other hand, it has kept our governments extremely responsive. So brittleness, yes, or just a terrible self-consciousness. When I worked for the Olympics, I was the Olympic spokesperson, and I had to deal with a whole lot of foreign journalists all the time, and they kept saying to me, this Australian expression you have, no worries, mate. It's a complete lie. You worry about everything.
Greg, your thoughts, please, for a minute.
Look, I've had the same impression as you. So that from quite early in the pandemic, there did seem to be a bit of an edge of hysteria. And I remember saying to my wife, this isn't exactly the sort of Battle of Britain spirit. It's hard to imagine this population, surviving bombs being rained down by the Luftwaffe.
Well, we haven't been through a war, of course.
No, we haven't. But Prue's right. I mean, there are certain things we do incredibly well, like bushfires. I think there's something in the Australian temperament that finds it much harder to deal with an ongoing, long-term, insidious, invisible enemy.
Very interesting.
Rather than something like a fire that you can see and whack.
Rally round. I'm just looking at the time. I just think this is so interesting and it's preoccupying me. And I'm going to take that no worries with me, Prue. That's very clever, I think. So Prue Groud and Greg Craven, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And we'll be back after 8. Well, hello there. Lovely to have you company in this first week of the new financial year. And I do hope you can stay with us. We're going to be talking about China in a moment, and also a lovely intervention in Indigenous communities about trying to stop fears. We were talking about before the news. Stop fears about vaccinations and so on. But it's time now for this week's Guess the Game Changer, our Saturday Extra quiz question about big characters from our recent times who shifted the agenda and whose legacy still live with us in one or other form. Who am I? I became known as a peacemaker, even though that wasn't where I started out in my public career, basically as a civil servant who rose and rose. I believed in big plans, above all, whatever it took to avert conflicts. I tried hard not to take sides, but some thought I did, and therefore maybe I walked into a trap. I see they're still writing books about my untimely, mysterious death. Who am I? Now, I hope that was slow enough. People have said, read it slowly. So I did try. So, a peacemaker who had an untimely, mysterious death. Who am I? So I'll announce the results at the end of the show, and we do take 2 answers. One that comes through, if you can just say whether you're listening to air or you're listening on the app, because apparently there's a small delay, so people didn't want to be disadvantaged. So we're allowing for that, and we're doing 2 separate. So just say where you are and, if you like, your name. First name only. Now, to return to the present day, but very much influenced by past events, have a listen to this.
伟大光荣正确的中国共产党万岁！
Yes, that was just a taste of the huge celebrations taking place in China this week to celebrate the centenary of the Chinese Communist Party. I don't think I've seen as many hammers and sickles for a very, very long time. I mean, it really was quite remarkable. Not hyperbole. Listening to that, it's hard to believe that 100 years ago, China was a country on its knees, and that the party was really just 13 men meeting in a little room in Shanghai to discuss a new way forward. Now, these days, it's hard to separate anything in China from the party. As President Xi Jinping has said, the government, the armed forces, society and academia, east, west, south, north and centre. The party leads everything. And it's the history of the party that underpins its actions, both at home and abroad. So to discuss this important anniversary with clear implications for Australia's future, I was joined earlier this week by 3 leading sinologists. Kerry Brown, who's director of the Lao China Institute and professor of Chinese Studies at King's College in London, who knows Australia well. Rana Mitter, professor of the History and Politics of Modern China at the University of Oxford. And Linda Javen is the author of The Shortest History of China and a scholar for many years. And I welcome them all to Saturday Extra.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
Now, I'd like to hear from you all, just to kick us off, what you all think and the words you choose to describe the significance of this anniversary. First to you, Kerry Brown.
Well, it's very iconic. I mean, it's not just the anniversary of the party, obviously, it's a national anniversary because of the symbolism, the fact that China is in pole position to be the world's biggest economy sometime in the next decade, maybe even sooner. And I think it kind of feeds into these nationalistic narratives, which are very important to sustain the legitimacy of the party because of the nation that it leads.
And Rana Mitter, how would you answer that?
I'd say that the rise of the Chinese Communist Party over the last 100 years, Geraldine, is an example of how history has nothing inevitable about it. There are so many occasions in that 100 years when this tiny fledgling party, as you mentioned, it was just a bare dozen people, 13 people who founded that party 100 years ago. They could have basically been destroyed in the famous Long March of the 1930s. They could have been wiped out by the Japanese during World War II. All sorts of occasions when things could have gone wrong. And therefore, from that to where we are today, where they've got, as you've said, over 90 million members, and they run a country that's the second biggest economy, second biggest military in the world, influencing global decisions, and of course, putting forward a very different model of international and domestic government compared to most Western or liberal countries. That is a journey that was not inevitable, but is of huge historic importance.
And Linda, how would you see it?
Well, I agree with both of those comments, but I'd also like to add that it's so interesting. The history of the party is so malleable and is so falsified that the 1st of July wasn't actually the founding date of the Communist Party. It was July 23rd. What happened was in 1941, when Mao in Yan'an, in the caves of Yan'an, the Long March was over and they were there and they didn't really have much documents that they'd carried with them. Mao thought, we should celebrate this 2 decades of the party. Couldn't remember when it was founded, couldn't remember the exact date, just that it was July. And so they just decided, okay, let's just make it July 1st. So the history is really interesting, and it's terribly important to the party to tell it in a particular way, but it's also terribly important to understand how history functions for the Communist Party, which is not necessarily as a record of what actually happened.
No, and that has been such an interesting story about all the tales around people being invited to dob in, for instance, on historical nihilism at the moment, right now. Look, let's go back to where it all started, to this moment when these 13 men met in a Shanghai room, which I've gone and visited as a tourist, and I found it incredibly affecting to just see it. Tell us about a sense of what was happening in China at the time, just to get this context, because it's very, very different to the China we know now.
Could I jump in there, Geraldine? I think one of the things that is most notable about that period, and it's the atmosphere that gives rise to the Chinese Communist Party that eventually comes into being in 1921, is a really important nationalist movement known as the May 4th movement. And that date is because May 4th, 1919, is when about 3,000 students, young, patriotic intellectuals, men and women, gather in front of the Gate of Heavenly Peace in the centre of Beijing to protest about the raw deal that China has got at the Versailles Treaty at the end of World War I. And that's just one incident. It takes a few hours, but it symbolises a whole decade when China's thinkers, China's intellectuals looked at what had happened to their country and despaired. They'd overthrown the last emperor in 1912. That was the end of the old 2,000 years of the imperial system. And yet within 5 to 7 years, the country had dissolved from being a parliamentary republic, as they had hoped, to being basically a place where different military leaders fought with each other for control. So in the end, they summed up their problems as being warlords from inside, imperialists from outside, meaning the British, the French, the Japanese, and they came up with an answer. And what they wanted was 2 gentlemen. They said, Mr. Science and Mr. Democracy. And that's the atmosphere from which the Chinese Communist Party emerges. But it's worth remembering that lots of other ideas were there too. Anarchism, fascism even, that's one thing that some people are interested in, liberalism. So the Communist Party that emerged with those 13 young men was just one possible solution in that very exuberant but also despairing time of the early 1920s as China tried to find its way into the modern world.
And I think you make the point. Yes, okay, Linda, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yes, it's such a good point. And if I can just make the point that the person who said China needs Mr. Democracy and Mr. Science was Chen Duxiu, who was elected in absentia by those 13 or 12 men in Shanghai to be the very first Secretary General of the party. Now, he started out being a fan of democracy and very, very critical of Chinese traditional culture, to the extent that somebody accused him of wanting to destroy Confucianism. And he said, yeah. And this is a really interesting point. After the Russian Revolution, the Soviet Union, unlike any of the other imperialist powers who had, the French concession and this and that, they said, okay, we don't want any of the things that we have taken from China. You can have it all back. Now, this increased the appeal of Marxism and Soviet-style revolution to people like Chen Duxiu.
Yeah, gosh. Yeah, this tension between representing tradition and really a sort of glorious story, I just find totally fascinating, because it's just so clearly animating. It's a tension there right now. I just want to come back to Rana about the increasing role in this emerging Chinese story that World War II, you've alluded to World War I, which was sort of, humiliating, as some of their territories were just given away. But how did World War II, you claim that has become the basis for an approach to international relations and China's place in the post-1945 order too?
It's absolutely transformative for the Chinese Communist Party, Geraldine. Basically, we're summarising a lot of history in a very short time, but the mid-1930s, sees the Chinese Communists on the run. They go on the famous Long March when they're chased by Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist leader of the time, the leader of China, from the southern part of China through the mountains into the northwest, where they finally end up exhausted, just a few thousand of them. They look like they're on the way out. And then just a couple of years later, in 1937, the simmering tensions in Asia between the rising force of Japanese imperialism just over the sea and that rising force of Chinese nationalism, which we were talking about. And remember, the Chinese communists were always nationalists as well, with a small n, in the sense that they believed in a strong nation state. So Japan invades China in 1937, and bingo, these two sets of deadly enemies, the communists on the run after the Long March and the nationalist government, the Kuomintang of Chiang Kai-shek, have to fight together against the Japanese. Now, it's a very, very uneasy alliance, to put it mildly, but it does just about hold together until, of course, the Western powers, the Americans and the British, and of course the Australians, come along to Asia in 1941 after Pearl Harbor. But it has a real effect on the balance of power, because if you had to summarize, I think, one thing that shifts power in the middle of the 20th century in China, it's World War II. The nationalist government, which rules China at the start, is weakened, broken, and the Chinese Communist Party becomes stronger and stronger. By 1945, the atomic bombs have dropped. It's the end of World War II in Asia, and there's more than 1 million men under arms, Soviet arms, a bit of Soviet training, lots of influence. And as the civil war between the communists and the nationalists begins in 1946, the communists are well poised, trained, armed, ready to fight, whereas their old nationalist opponents, having exhausted themselves against the Japanese, are basically on the verge of collapse. Yeah. So World War II really makes the difference. OK, let's move on to this extraordinary rise, though, Linda, of the rise of the Communist Party having defeated the nationalists by 1949. What were the key things that happened after Mao proclaimed the birth of the People's Republic of China? Could you tell us particularly about the system of government they established, which I think is very important to acknowledge? The system of government that they established was, now don't forget, the party itself is based on Leninist lines, and it still is. What they did was they established a system of government where you have parallel bureaucracies. So you have the State Council on the one hand, which is the administrative side, and you have the party, the Central Committee and the ruling bodies within the Central Committee, the highest being the Politburo Standing Committee on the other. And this kind of parallel structure is reflected throughout the country. In, for example, a province will have somebody who is the administrative governor, but you will also have the party secretary. In every state-run enterprise that was established as the economy became collectivized,
every state-run enterprise has its head of production and so on, and its party secretary. And this continues today. The big tech firms and the big companies in China all have to have a party secretary, and the party secretary does have the final word.
Now, Kerry Brown, these two chapters, I loathe the overuse of the word horrific, but they genuinely are horrific in China's history. The Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, they certainly won't, I doubt, feature in the story that we're going to be hearing this week.
Yeah, I mean, well, they'll figure, not overtly, but I mean, the kind of Xi Jinping explanation for the somewhat turbulent history of the party is that it has always been a learning party, and it has always been trying to kind of undertake the project of modernity in China, even though it's experienced great challenges. So we'll get this narrative of an ever forward march. There won't be a big break between the Maoist period up till, kind of 1978 and the start of the reform period. I mean, these will be part of a common narrative. They won't be presented as being opposed to each other. They'll be presented as a natural, flowing story. But I mean, I think the party has always been in the business of two things. One is seeking legitimacy. I mean, it's a curious thing. We talk about its power today, and, it looks powerful. It's got huge numbers of members. It's, as you said, that Xi Jinping quote earlier on, at the centre of everything. And yet it's at the centre of everything because it's nervous about everything. And that, legitimacy-seeking kind of function of the party is a curious thing. The other is that it's always been a storytelling party, right from the beginning. It's revised its history in 1945 informally under Mao Zedong. There was a kind of narrative of the history. That history was retold in 1981. And then just recently, Xi Jinping has issued a new short history of the party. And that always shows that there is no contradictions in the narrative of the party. So things like the Great Leap Forward, the Great Cultural Revolution, they're not ignored necessarily, although they're not overtly spoken about a great deal, but they're presented as part of this learning process. And that's really where
a learning process
it comes
that took absolutely millions of lives. So there's certainly no Truth and Reconciliation Commission in China, is there?
Well, the ethical view of the party, I think, is that you sacrifice in order for the greater good. That's always been the problem. The party doesn't really have a sort of ethical foundation in a way. I mean, Marxism doesn't really talk a great deal about ethics. So, I mean, that is how it presents it, that these were necessary sacrifices. Not a very attractive ethical view, I suppose, but that's the way it presents it.
Yeah. Yes. In fact, Rana Mitter, you say it's important to see this as a Marxist-Leninist regime. Not people say Marxist, but actually that's inadequate to describe what has emerged.
It is. It's Marxist in the sense that it believes in a whole variety of philosophical ideas that, go way back to the 18th century European philosopher Hegel, and, his thought floats through everything that Mao said, amongst others. But exactly what Kerry and Linda too, I think, have been talking about, which is Leninism as the idea of a top-down elite, which is essentially the contradictory sounding term, the people's democratic dictatorship. And you use that basically as the means to turn the society in the way you want to go, using terror as a perfectly legitimate tool. And we talked about morality just now with Kerry. One of the early sets of thinking from an early Chinese communist leader named Tsai He-sen was the idea that actually something he admired really about the Leninist viewpoint was the idea that you could do evil for a greater good. That is not a Confucian view. But just one other thought on that, Geraldine. You talked about there's no Truth and Reconciliation Commission in China, and that, I have to say, is sadly true. But do remember that at times that have been more open, and I'm talking about, even just 5-10 years ago, there were lots of people collecting, for instance, oral histories of exactly the events you mentioned, the horrific Great Leap Forward famine of the 50s that killed more than 20 million people, the Cultural Revolution, which may have killed as many as 2 million. People collecting oral histories, people recording what their grandparents had said. Many of these records have actually ended up being published. You can even find some on social media in China. It's sensitive, and of course these things quite often get wiped off or censored at times. But people do remember these things. They do want to remember them. And at times when it's relatively more open, of which this, I have to say, is not one, the party has sort of allowed those tacitly to be out there as a sort of safety valve against the kind of top-down history that Kerry was talking about.
In fact, I just quickly, you suggest in your writing, Linda, that China has thrived under the more relatively open times, like the Tang Dynasty, for instance.
Yes, I think, if you look at when China has produced its most, really beautiful culture, it has been when it has been open to all kinds of influences. I don't think we're going to see another Tang Dynasty for a long time, but in the 1980s, there was a limited version of that going on when Deng Xiaoping opened, the reforms were called the Reform and Open Door Policy. And I remember I was in China and people would say, when you go to Hong Kong, can you bring me back a book of German neo-expressionism? It was just incredible hunger for every kind of foreign philosophy, for literature, for art, to kind of understand how all of this can combine with their own experiences and some traditional Chinese ideas about aesthetics and so on. And there was a really vibrant culture going on.
Yeah, well, look, maybe we'll sort of assume that people know that the Deng Xiaoping changes were just phenomenally successful in terms of economic growth, really quite remarkable. It looked as though China might be on a trajectory to become a democracy in some views, and then that was certainly quashed after Tiananmen. And then we had the aggressive form of nationalism which really started to emerge. So let's talk about Xi Jinping now, and how he has reshaped the Communist Party. Now, what do you feel, Rana, doesn't get the coverage it deserves?
I think that the important thing when people compare Xi Jinping to Chairman Mao, which is a comparison that we hear quite a lot, the phrase that's thrown around a lot is, the most powerful single leader in China since Mao, is to understand two things. One, about why that's right, and one about why it's wrong, and understand them both at the same time. The reason that it's right is that Mao Zedong, of course, placed a huge amount of power in his own person, creating a sort of cult of personality, in effect. And the Cultural Revolution back in the 60s was the major manifestation of that for Mao. And Xi Jinping has also, of course, got his image everywhere. There's this sort of use of the propaganda machinery to give him a sort of nickname, Xi Dada, Uncle Xi, although that's been used slightly less in recent years than before. This image of him as this benevolent kind of father figure, rather as Linda was saying. And that in some ways is very similar to Mao. But the point at which I think he's fundamentally different is that Mao, in the end, was always very much about a political project of revolutionizing China from the grassroots. Mao really believed in stirring up the masses and getting them to basically rise up in their own right. Not in a kind of liberal democratic way that we would expect in the Western world, but very much as part of a kind of fierce revolutionary force.
He wanted to throw over tradition, didn't he? He thought the tradition was completely desiccated.
Absolutely. The Cultural Revolution was based on the idea of smashing the four old, old thought, old customs and so forth. Now let's turn to Xi Jinping. If you can name two things that Xi Jinping does not want under any circumstances, number one is a revolution in China, whereas he does want to make sure that there's top-down, quite technocratic control in which the masses essentially know their place and do not try and overthrow the system. And that's completely different from what Mao wanted. You can summarize it actually in the way that they both looked to Confucius. Confucius, who we mentioned over and over again, for Mao, the worst enemy of China, this black hand from the past who had to be eliminated. Mao used Confucius and the destruction of Confucius to make his revolution. Xi Jinping is, of course, promoting the idea of Confucius as a great Chinese sage and in some ways implying comparisons with himself. So for Xi Jinping, Confucius is there to prevent a revolution, not to cause one. And that makes him very different from Mao.
Indeed. Kerry Brown, how do you, as you're watching him develop, if I can put it like that, what's surprising you, what's not surprising you?
Well, Xi Jinping is the individual that had a career. I think he tried to join the Communist Party 10 times in the early 70s. His father was a senior leader who was sidelined before the Cultural Revolution. I think he was involved in the cultural area. He was a vice minister of culture, or minister of culture, and a vice premier. And then, kind of worked his way up basically from being an operative in the People's Liberation Army, moving into the civilian government and then going through all the levels of governance. But I mean, the thing that I'm puzzled by and continue to be puzzled by is what is it about him and his political abilities as an individual in a system where I don't see any real clue that individualism is, greatly rewarded. It's about loyalty and about basically, serving the corporate interests of the party. And what is it about? The party as an entity that has to continue and sustain. I mean, his fundamental mission is to make one party rule sustainable in China. I mean, that's it. And that's the mission of the party and all of the people that work in the party. So I think we've kind of been had in a way. We're kind of going on and on about Xi Jinping, this figure who's autocratic and domineering. And I think it's a distraction, because what it's really about is this enormous corporate entity, the Communist Party, basically kind of using a particular charismatic and attention-grabbing form of leadership in order to achieve some fundamental realignments as it moves into the future.
So in other words, you're saying that there's a lot of collaboration and agreement with a whole range of others around Xi to put this image forward.
Well, so no one's ever really explained how he became the supreme leader in the first place. I mean, we all have these sort of anecdotes. China politics is full of anecdotes. So we had the anecdotes about, Deng Xiaoping making one sentence about Hu Jintao in the 1990s, and that meant that his succession in 2001 after Jiang Zemin was assured. We kind of know why Jiang Zemin was appointed in 89, because everyone else proved themselves to be useless. I mean, in the views of the party. But with Xi Jinping, two things are really weird about the way that he became leader was, first of all, that it happened kind of almost effortlessly. And the second, since then, you ask me, what I'm surprised by is that there is no sign, really, of any major internal opposition to him. I mean, there's been in the past with other leaders, Jiang Zemin and Qiao Shi and Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, some sign of tensions. But this is like a smooth pond. You don't see any ripples. People look hard, they see a little bit, but it's not that major. That's really weird too.
Well, in fact, there's a fascinating quote from Richard McGregor, who, as you know, is one of our very good observers based in Australia now, and whose book on the party has been very, very well respected. And he suggests that the big challenge for China, and because of China's position in the world, for the rest of the world as well, is succession. Xi has thrown out the rule book on succession. China looked like it had solved the big problem of how to have a peaceful and orderly transition of power. But that lack of succession creates an uncertain future. And he looks at the history, and yes, it's a terrible history of lack of peace in succession going right back, over millennia, Linda. So is this something, well, it's following on really from what Kerry is saying. Do you think, how do you see this?
Yes, I was fascinated by Kerry's analysis, because I do agree with this. And I think that, as you say, succession has been a problem for thousands of years. There are so many stories of how emperors, there's been fratricides and patricides and the killing of sons. And, it's rarely been pretty, actually. And so this is a great anxiety, and I'm so curious how it is supposed to be solved. I think it's useful to look back at the way he micromanages, and he's the chairman of every committee, the chairman of everything. It's useful to look at the first Ming emperor, Hongwu, who was so distrustful of ministers and officials and so on that he got rid of the position of prime minister. He basically got rid of delegating and he became the chairman of everything. And he set up certain things that actually helped the Ming dynasty fail in the end. Yeah. And I don't know, we do have the odd dissident. The problem is we can't hear those voices very easily. There's Xu Jiangrun, who Jeremy Barmay has been translating, but most people who are dissidents inside and outside the party have been effectively silenced.
How do
Could
they...
I just come in there,
yes.
actually? So this is a really key thing, which is extraordinary. Academics, people who usually would be sort of staking out a kind of slightly alternative vision. They did exist even in the worst era of the Maoist period. Even in the Cultural Revolution, well, particularly in the Cultural Revolution, there were alternative voices because they were legitimized by the Red Guard movement or more rebellious movements. And the weird thing now is that, academics who used to have sometimes quite strongly contrarian views, apart from a very, very few who operate in the way that Linda's just referred to, have fallen into line. And I'm really puzzled by that. I mean, it's like I'm looking at a stage where it was once full of different actors, and suddenly, for no reason I can work out, at a time when the plot has got really complicated and really, really detailed, everyone has disappeared, and we're just looking at one guy having a monologue.
Maybe it is to do with a need to re-establish China, and to get over the centuries of humiliation and to reposition itself on the world stage. But I noticed, Rana Mehta, earlier this year you wrote, and I'm quoting you, the biggest obstacle China will face is not the hostility of the United States or other adversaries. It's instead China's own authoritarian turn. Now, I wonder if you could just sort of bring us to a conclusion by reflecting on that, particularly with respect to, say, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and of course Xinjiang.
Absolutely, Geraldine. It's a very Cultural Revolution technique to get someone's writings and read them out to them and then make them account for their words, but I'll do my best. A very gentle Cultural Revolution in this case,
very
I
gentle.
hasten to add. Look, I do believe that this is very much the case. I think that there is no doubt, no reasonable observer could look at the China of today, second biggest economy in the world, huge innovator in all sorts of areas of technology, undertaking a massive poverty reduction program, real international influence. Nobody could look at that country and say that it hadn't, under the party, achieved a lot of things that its founders 100 years ago would never have dreamed of. But I think that it is storing up a huge problem for itself by the way in which it's restricting information and discussion. Because if we think about all of those things that we've just talked about, they came from some really important and often robust and sometimes really quite savage debates within the party and within the society. Because time's limited, let's just take the one example, the economic miracle that we all associate with China from the last 40 years. That came because of really fierce debates within the party about whether or not you used kind of Western liberal economics, whether you learnt from the reformers in Eastern Europe before the Soviet Union fell. And these were not nice, polite little teacup type debates. These were things that really mattered to people and had winners and losers. That ability to speak out is now being essentially hit by the feeling that keeping silent is easier. So in Hong Kong today, technically, you could, publish all sorts of very critical comments about the government and not be breaking the law, because the law is still different in Hong Kong from what it is in the mainland. But what we know in practice is that thinkers, journalists, academics, people in the media are not doing so because they're worried that it might go wrong. Just one final note on that, because it comes from a voice within China. Recently, the South China Morning Post in Hong Kong, which still actually publishes a lot of quite critical material about what's happening in China, but it does it in English for more perhaps an international audience. A professor from Peking University, Professor Jia Qingguo, who's actually a big member of a consultative committee to the party, said that it was becoming harder and harder to give really good policy advice to top levels of Chinese government because Chinese academics could no longer talk easily to foreign scholars and take part in academic exchanges. And if we want to avoid, as we all do, the United States, Australia, the Western world getting into a real conflict with China, then talking to each other is really important. And right now, what's happening in Beijing is not making it easy to do that.
Linda, I've just got to say this. Not one woman has ever been appointed to the Politburo Standing Committee in all of those years. Isn't that, I'm sorry, that's just disgraceful as far as I'm concerned. How did this happen?
I agree. I mean, look, you look at the 12 men or 13 men who founded the party, and there has never been a sense that the women are equals, despite all of the rhetoric that's around, equality and the rights of women and so on. It's quite interesting. The origin of that very famous saying by Mao of women hold up half the sky actually came from a very practical place and didn't have anything to do with political power. What had happened was there was a little village. It was in the 50s. Agriculture was being collectivized and people were being paid in what they called work points. But the men were earning, I can't remember what it was, like maybe 4 times as many work points as the women. So the 23 women in the village just went, yeah, you guys go out and work. It's not worth it. So they stayed at home. Now the woman, the head of women's work in the village, went to the village chief and said, I've got a solution, maybe equal pay for equal work. And the village chief said, okay, let's try it. Now, the interesting thing is production tripled. It didn't double when the women came out, it tripled. So when Mao, hearing this, said, women hold up half the sky, but the intention was never political. So there's always been this sense of women's place. It's not expressed explicitly, but it really is a problem for the Communist Party.
Maybe I'm going to give final word to Kerry Brown. You say that what might determine the future of the Chinese Communist Party is how it adjusts from the creed of being on a mission, which it's held on to for the past 100 years, to one that is about preserving what has been achieved.
Well, I mean, the great challenge the Communist Party is dealing with is success. It's creating the world's greatest capitalist economy, but it's a one-party state, and that has completely upturned all the narratives about modern history. I mean, I think the next decade is the real kind of moment, because we see a leadership of Xi Jinping, which is not really about him, it's about something else. We see a party which is actually not about the party, it's about the great nation. And we see a great nation which doesn't really seem to want to be a sort of nation on the same template as the United States. So I think that it's a preparation for something. And I think that the only thing that we can say about it is that, as all foreign commentators have proved over the last 50 years, at least since 1978, every single prediction about China usually ends up being wrong. So on that note, I'm going to keep my mouth shut.
Look, thank you all very much for tilting at this rather big windmill. Kerry Brown, Rana Mitter and Linda Javen, thank you so much.
Thank you, Geraldine.
Thank you, Geraldine.
And Kerry Brown from King's College London, Rana Mitter from the University of Oxford, Linda Javen, the author of The Shortest History of China, published by Black Ink. And thank you very much indeed for your feedback as well. I might mention tomorrow on Sunday Extra, former diplomat Stephen Fitzgerald will be talking about his experience as the first Australian ambassador to the People's Republic. And no doubt that extraordinary trip by Gough Whitlam to China in 1971. They left 2 days later. I think it might have even been the same night Kissinger arrived. As somebody wrote this week, that was genuinely a week that changed the world. Kissinger arrived ahead of the rapprochement with Nixon and China. Incredible times to remember. We didn't realise we were living through them, though. Well, up next, as we head into NAIDOC Week, a celebration of Aboriginal and Islander cultures, a story of some terrific things happening in the Northern Territory and regional Victoria. Yes, there's been understandable anxiety in the Territory about the COVID cases there, particularly about the virus possibly spreading to Aboriginal communities. But never fear, Captain Sanitizer is here. In about 2 weeks' time, vaccination will start in the town of Wadeye, about 4.5 hours southwest of Darwin. And Captain Sanitizer, a man called Dallas Mugara, who is from Wadeye, and who is right now making another of his crazy health messaging videos, which are very popular on TikTok and Facebook. And they'll be employed there in Wadeye and probably in Maningrida, which I think is being rolled out even earlier. In white hazmat-style overalls, with an improvised captain's hat, he leaps into situations, very vividly, to show people how to keep themselves safe. His next video will try to persuade the community that despite any fears they may have about vaccination, it's a good thing to do. Now, the videos are backed by the Tumra Youth Indigenous Corporation, which works out of both Wadeye and the Victorian high country town of Bright. And that's an interesting story in itself, which we'll come to. But I'm delighted to welcome Captain Sanitizer himself, Dallas Mugara. Thanks for joining us, Dallas.
No worries. Thank you. Good to be here.
And also, welcome to Justin Crowley, who's CEO of that youth corporation. He's in Darwin, where he's been in quarantine, and he's about to head out to Wadeye. Hello, Justin.
Good morning, Geraldine.
Now, I know you're in Bright in Victoria at the moment, Dallas, but you're in constant contact with friends and family in Wadeye, and you've recently been back there, haven't you? Are people wary about getting vaccinated?
Yes. Most people don't know what this vaccination for, and some people know about it, but they just fear that it might happen, something to them or might get worse.
And are they talking about it or not talking about it, if you know what I mean?
Well, the community was advised that the vaccination people will, be coming to town for those who want to be vaccinated. And I think, a lot of people are very scared of what it might turn out to be. But, yeah, I reckon it's all about the right information. We're trying to put it out there, the right information, so that people can understand more about it, because they still don't know.
And they're still scared. Gee, that's hard to hear. Justin, have you been hearing that too from your colleagues in the community?
I think it's across the board, across the country, whether it's a remote community or anyone. I think we're all a little bit apprehensive and sort of looking for clarity. One of the things that's important to mention is that Dallas is Captain Sanitizer and doing some social media things in language around the vaccines. He's part of a coordinated approach in Wadair for the vaccine rollout. So we're one of the service providers or the local groups, locally owned groups out there, and we've been part of a larger group coordinated by NT government who are working together to try and make this as effective as possible. And one of our roles is to engage social media and do some things in language, and that's where someone like Dallas, with his sort of knack of being able to reach the people, is, hugely important.
Yeah, indeed.
And that's how Captain Sanitizer came about. And Dal would be able to elaborate on that, because it was his alter ego is around having a bit of fun with the message so that people aren't so scared of it.
It's a lot of fun, Dallas, I must say, watching it, because you started making them last year, didn't you, when the COVID began? You were in Victoria then, and you were worried right from the outset about the people back home. Is that right?
Yeah, and everybody was so scared. Now that they know how to prepare for if there's possible COVID cases in the community, yeah, I reckon it's helpful.
Just to give people an idea, Captain Sanitizer leaps in to stop people sharing, say, a bottle of Coke or a cigarette, doesn't he? And the videos are about washing hands, things like that. So you're really showing. It's very visible, isn't it? But it's fun and friendly too.
Yeah. Yeah, the idea was to make people comfortable and put a smile on them, because of the humour that we put into our work.
Dallas, what language, because you've got several groups in Wadair, which language are you using?
Morimpata is the common language that everyone speaks and understand.
Okay, because there's a lot of smiles and, sort of slapsticky, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
And Justin, you'd think that information was coming to the communities through official channels, that this wouldn't be needed. Is that not the case?
Well, I guess it's the reason that there's a lot of information coming through. It's a matter of how do you get it into the homes, and that's where Dallas and Captain Sanitizer have been so successful. Because when he started doing these messages and having fun with them, he used a platform, which was TikTok at the time, that a lot of local people were using. And what that meant was by doing it on his own platform, on his own account, and then sharing it with family, and then they would share it. So all of a sudden you had it going into homes in language and a recognisable person that they could connect with. Whereas a lot of the messages that come out, they might go onto a work platform, even for us as Tumra Youth, if we put something on our Facebook or our Instagram or whatever it might be, it's highly unlikely we would get much traction in the community. We'd get those that follow us and a few others. But by going through his personal account and creating his own persona and doing it in language, it spread really quickly, and he was getting 4,000 or 5,000 views each time he was putting one of these messages up. And he was also working with Jerry Bidding, and the pair of them were just having a lot of fun with it. And, they were learning and then trying to share that message at the same time. And we learned a lot as an organisation about how we get messages to the community.
Oh, interesting. Just in terms of really making it of the community and heading right back with a lot of humour. Because he takes risks. You take a lot of risks with yourself, Dal. You send yourself up silly, I think, don't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, we did. We learned a lot. And, it's important to understand that you're dealing with, people who don't follow mainstream media. And, you know, if messages are coming out in English or even coming out in Murrumbatta, but they're not actually somewhere where people can actually visit and view them, then the message doesn't go very far. And that's been a really important insight from this whole journey of COVID.
I can imagine. I mean, there are only a few thousand people in the Wadeye region, Dallas, so people must be watching them over and over again. And I know that you went back to Wadeye recently. Did you get that sense?
Yeah, you know, I felt like people there recognized me as Captain Sanitizer. You know, I walked around the shop and, you know, every time I go there, people see me and they go, "Hey, Captain," you know. That makes me feel proud of what I do, and, you know, the way I see it makes them proud too, because someone from the community with familiar faces, familiar language, so that people know that, you know, someone's doing something out there from the community that they're from, you know.
No, I can imagine. No, I could see exactly what you're saying. The fact that you're both based in Victoria itself is quite a story. It started with you really, Justin, didn't it? Back when you were a secondary school teacher in Wadeye.
Well, yeah, I was involved. So it was back in 2008 when some elders approached us about setting up a program for youth leadership and, you know, something to, you know, create pathways for the future and try and combat, you know, some of the loss of decision-making and understanding around what, you know, things like welfare and that were sort of taking control of the direction of the community and always changing. One particular elder was quite strong, he's since passed away, but quite strong on this, you know, we need to get some young people to actually understand what's going on and come back here and help people have choices and make decisions about what they do in their life rather than being dictated to by things that they don't understand.
Yeah, and I understand the key thing was to get kids have the ability to get away from the community, to have a look at other ways of living, and then possibly go back to the community. So it was to sort of instill confidence in the kids, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was never about going away and staying away. It was always about going away and learning and looking at, you know, what's out there and how we can use that to make our own choices about how we live our life. But also by having that opportunity and having choices, being accountable for those choices. And that's been a strong theme right through our program.
So it's essentially you offer, Bright, in the high country of Victoria, offers people, I think you've got about 17 people from Wadeye there now, most are at school, and the organisation, your Tamara Youth Indigenous Corporation, runs out of both Wadeye and Bright. And it's a very interesting fact here, I understand, that it's actually owned by Wadeye, and all the directors are Indigenous Wadeye people.
Yeah, so our structure, we're run by the Wadeye community or the Tamara region. Our directors are all, you know, represent the ceremonial groups from there, and they're all young people, and they control and direct, you know, how we go. A lot of our directors now are people who have been through our program, and a big part of that is understanding what is out there and, you know, how the other half of the world works. The greatest challenge is to try and make sure that we're not just heading in one direction and we're valuing, you know, the cultural side of things and making sure there's a nice balance. Because I think with most programs these days, even though we talk about co-design and things like that, it all seems to be heavily, you know, biased towards the Western side of living and not necessarily listening and valuing the Indigenous or, you know, cultural side of things as much.
Yes, I must say I didn't know about this. You know, there's a building apparently that used to be a backpackers, and one half's the girls' house with house parents, the other side of boys, also with house parents. So, Dallas, how many years have you been in Bright now?
Since probably 5 or 6 years now, I reckon, yeah.
You pretty happy there?
Yeah. You know, seeing different kids coming in and go, I reckon it's great to be here, and, you know, because the community here needs to learn about us as well as we do about this world.
And you're all pretty involved with the local football and netball club, I hear.
Not me particularly, but
others.
The boys, they do.
And the to and fro between Wadeye and Bright, I suppose that's what really intrigues me. First to you, Justin, does that work well?
Oh, it's a challenge. It's a long way from one end of the country to the other, and they're totally different environments and cultural experiences. So it's a challenge, but it does work. A big part of it is having that relationship. Bright has a strong understanding of who What Air is and what our program is. We run a strong training program through our partnership with Demu Balcony Cafe in Bright, and that's where all our trainees do their work readiness training. And that gives the community a base to sort of come in and see the kids and see them training and to learn about them, and it's a very important part of what we do. The same in What Air is, What Air understanding that, these kids that go away to Bright and, what Bright represents. So it works, but it's a long way, and, travel can be a massive challenge, being able to respect decision-making of families around culture, funerals, ceremony, whatever it might be, and respecting that those decisions can be made, in a level that, someone like myself might not understand. And then balancing that between, why that decision was made versus, you might lose some money on flights, or you have to change flights and reorganise things, and trying to balance the two worlds because they don't line up.
Final word to you, Dallas. Do you think it works well? Would you like to see it working differently?
Yeah, I reckon it works well. And, when I was in What Air, a lot of youth around the area where I was, want to know about what we do up here so that they can be involved as well. Yeah, I reckon it's influencing the community back home to do more for themselves, for their family, Yeah.
Oh, it's a fantastic venture, I think. Congratulations to you both. I really appreciate you coming on and telling us about it, and keep going, Captain Sanitizer.
Thank you.
Keep an eye out for his sidekicks. He's created some new ones as well.
Oh, has he?
Yeah, he's got some sidekicks that he's worked with to tackle some other issues.
The captain and his corporal or something or other.
Yeah.
Okay, Dallas and Justin Crowley, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
See ya. See you, Dal.
Bye. See you, mate.
That's Dallas Magara, aka Captain Sanitizer, and Justin Crowley, the CEO of the Tamara Youth Indigenous Corporation. We've put a link to that organisation on our webpage. Apparently, the National Gallery in Canberra is asked to borrow Captain Sanitizer's uniform for an exhibition they're planning about COVID time, so how about that? And look, do stay tuned to Radio National for more discussions during the week of NAIDOC. And tomorrow night on ABC TV Plus at 8 o'clock on Compass, a documentary looking at how Aboriginal spiritual cultural beliefs thrive alongside Christian faith. So that should be something to await with interest. Now, it's time. The quiz reveal. Look, it was too easy, this one, I've decided. A couple of you did suggest Olive Palmer. Some suggested Harold Holt and Dr. David Kelly. I think that was about the untimely death. But the answer is, as so many of you knew, the second Secretary-General of the UN, Dag Hammarskjöld, born in Sweden from a political family, a Swedish Department of Foreign Affairs star before, in 1953, becoming head of the UN. This was a bold plan, the UN, to create and maintain world peace and security after the horrors of World War II. Hammarskjöld really developed the political role of the Secretary-General, creating a far more prominent body with a strong philosophy that it was best to stop conflicts before they began, that decolonising countries needed lots of help to stand on their own 2 feet, and that the UN had to be neutral. But in September 1961, on a peace mission to the newly independent Congo, his plane crashed. Everybody on board was killed, and what really happened remains one of the great unresolved mysteries of the 20th century. Now, you can go to The Conversation, the online journal The Conversation, and News Online to have a longer article on Dag Hammarskjöld. But the winners... Margaret was the first on radio. She didn't give us exactly where she was from. And Jared was the first on the app. So, look, thank you very much indeed. I must say there was people peppered us straight away with answers. And I might add some fantastic responses too about Eleanor Roosevelt last week. Really an amazing array of comments, including Peter Tate, T-A-I-T, sending us a play that she wrote about Eleanor and Mary Alice Evatt, that was published by Currency Press. You might like to seek that out. It's really fascinating to read. So look, thank you very much. A new COVID app has been put together by researchers from the ANU and the University of Queensland, coordinating hotspots and real-time updates, and we will give you, we'll put a link on our website that should allow you to access it, and that just might sort of clarify things for you.
You've been listening to an ABC podcast. Discover more great ABC podcasts, live radio and exclusives on the ABC Listen app.